Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Roaming Prepper, and I'm your host, Pete. And today, we're going to do yet another segment of the domino effect. And today, I want to dive into a specific topic that other channels have brought up. Some were fear-mongering, some were well-intentioned, but I think they missed a couple of things, and I wanted to elaborate on them. So I'll be right back, and let's talk about exactly what could or should happen under martial law, but I'm going to go into the weeds on this one. I'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody, and this is Roaming Prepper with yet another episode of the Domino Effect. Now, for those of you who are new to the Domino Effect, this is a weekly series that'll probably wind up being 7 or 8 long. And what I'm doing is going into specific aspects of what we're seeing in society now, or things that could happen, and how they fit into the overall situation we're all facing as far as inflation, monetary policy, supply chain, other stuff, geopolitics. But I'm breaking it apart, so we're not looking at this big mess of items, big mess of subjects. We're breaking apart the individual subjects to show how they could affect us, or they're affecting the current situation, but how they can affect us. And then with that information, what can we do to better prepare ourselves and understand it? Again, it's very easy to go down this rabbit trail of fear-mongering. I want to give you information from different sources, if you will, and give you something that you can use, because at the end of the day, if we're putting out videos, granted, it could be my opinion, which is fine and dandy, but if it's not something you can take action on, it's not actionable information, then it's kind of just me ranting and raving. Although, to be fair, some of us like to rant and rave, including myself, and there's a value to that. In any case, so today's subject, getting back on track, martial law. And I've seen a lot of channels have been talking about it recently, the possibilities of martial law. Now, a lot of them are very well intentioned, and they've said, hey, look, this is what could happen. And they tend to lean toward the extremes because that's what you find when you look. There's some channels that are absolutely fear-mongering, and they're like, oh my God, there'll be martial law and they'll kick in your door. But is that really how it works? And is there historical precedent to it? So again, I'm not only an engineer, I almost was a history major on top of being an engineering major. So I love to dig into the weeds on this kind of stuff. And so I want to start with some details. So first, let's define martial law, because being able to define the martial law. So from the Office of Justice Programs, which you could find yourself, ojp.gov, I'll show you right now. Martial law involves the temporary substitution of military authority for civilian rule and is usually invoked in a time of war, rebellion, or natural disaster. When martial law is in effect, the military commander of an area or country has unlimited authority to make and enforce laws. Now that's a very generic description, and oh, wrong way, sorry. And I'm going to throw that on there so you guys can kind of see the website. And again, I'm not going to hide anything. I'm going to encourage you guys and girls to do your own research so you understand what we're talking about. And again, all I'm doing is I'm pointing out details. So essentially, everyone's common understanding is martial law is declared when things have gotten out of hand to where typical responders, law enforcement, civil authorities, can no longer control a situation, or when there's widespread damage that exceeds the local ability to manage. Now, to this point, I can tell you as a guy who has completed all 4 courses of the FEMA Integrated Command Systems training. Okay, so I'm someone who's, in my last 4 years as a state guardsman here in Texas, went through the FEMA 1 through 800 series courses to understand not so much, oh, we're going to go out and this is how you check a checklist. No, we're talking about how is it structured. So in an emergency, and this is by law, this is the design. So this is the modern version, for those of you who are a little bit older, the old civil defense, but under the FEMA/Homeland structure. Any emergency starts at the local level. So for me, for instance, it would start at my city and or county level. That would be between the judge and the sheriff, constitutionally speaking, in Texas. Then if it's within the city limits where I am, so I have a city within a county, right? Then it would be the mayor as well. Now, if the mayor or any of them is unable, the others will make decisions. If all of them are gone, the city council takes over, or the second in command of the sheriff's department. You kind of understand what I'm saying. But it still starts at the city, then the county, then the state, then the region, then the Fed. So it goes in that order. That's, for instance, why during Katrina, the National Guard took 2 weeks to get there, because what normally should have happened is the mayor, who was the local, that was Ray Nagin, would say, I think we're going to need help. This is going to get ugly, which he did, to his credit. The president, who was Bush at the time, said, Mayor Nagin, I hear you. I need a request from your governor. The feds, the FEMA just doesn't show up, nor do federal troops. However, the governor at the time, I believe was Mary Landrieu, did not like her fellow Democrat, Ray Nagin. They had something going on, nor did she like Bush, the Republican. So she was fighting with him too. So she sat on it saying, we can handle it, until the levees broke. Then Mayor Nagin freaked out and he's like, the city is underwater. Then she gave the go-ahead, but it still takes 2 weeks to mobilize all those assets, FEMA, Red Cross, National Guard. Needless to say, that was a mess. And they had some weird pseudo martial law where they were confiscating guns, and a lot of people look at that and it kind of freaks them out. But is that what always happens under a martial law type situation? Well, in reality, that should not have happened. By comparison, you look at Hurricane Harvey, which was a massive storm that flooded the third largest city in America, Houston. The state of emergency, not martial law, and I'm going to make that distinction in a minute, the state of emergency was declared 4 days before. But the National Guard had already been mobilized, so by declaring a state of emergency 4 days to a week in advance, it gave, was it Trump? No, I just blanked out. Trump or Obama, whoever was in office at the time, enough time to say, okay, federal assets, go, which is what their job is. Once the governor declares it, so the counties declared it early. The governor got the paperwork, said approved, went to the feds. That's why all the assets were in place, and despite the massive damage Hurricane Harvey did, the response was actually really good in the big picture because the assets were ahead, and they never imposed martial law, even though they did impose emergency conditions on those counties that were affected. So just to give you a little bit of background, how the structure of the integrated command system works. Now, any firefighter or police officer or EMT has probably taken some of these courses, and depending on how far along they got for their specific job, they probably can speak to this as well. But anyway, so remember, city or town, county, state, region, Fed, pretty much along those lines. So understanding that is important, because you don't just say, oh, there's a riot, martial law. Not necessarily. You only do it when either the local authorities are overwhelmed or there's no longer a local authority to go through. So we're going to go to the Journal of Law and Order, volume 37, issue 9, which was written in September of 1989. NCJRS. I'm going to show you the website, and so you can read the article yourself. You may need to pause, but I'm trying to hold it as still as I can while I'm talking. In any case, when martial law is in effect, the military commander of an area or country has unlimited authority to make and enforce laws. Martial law is justified when, listen to this, martial law is justified when civilian authority has ceased to function, is completely absent, or has become ineffective. Further, martial law suspends all existing laws as well as civil authority in the ordinary administration of justice. In the United States, martial law can be declared by proclamation of the president or state governor, but such a formal proclamation is not necessary. And then it says, although the U.S. Constitution makes no specific provision for the imposition of martial law, nearly every state has a constitutional provision at the state level authorizing the government to impose martial law. So what it's saying is the U.S. Constitution for the federal government does not have a provision saying it can declare martial law, although it is understood that in the event of rebellion, invasion, insurrection, like a legitimate civil war, for instance, or War of 1812, we get invaded, the president can declare martial law in that area. But other than that, that's primarily a state function, constitutionally speaking, at both the state and the federal constitution levels. So hopefully you guys are tracking me here. So it's not a magic button that the president could say, oh, there's a riot here, I'm going to push the martial law button and kick in everyone's doors. That's not how this works. It's much more nuanced than that. The problem is there's some situations that have not happened yet and there's no basis, and I'm going to get into this. So martial law has been declared 9 times since World War II, and in 5 instances was designated to counter resistance to federal desegregation decrees in the South. Now at the time, this is desegregation, so this is back in the late 50s into the 1960s, right? There was a lot of riots, a lot of fighting, and local law enforcement in some cases was not consistent with the Supreme Court ruling that desegregation needed to occur. So the local authority was part of the problem, in which case that would fall under the case where the civilian authority has become ineffective. They're not enforcing what should be enforced. You guys tracking me? Or was absent, either that or the local police just couldn't handle the situation because there was such an uproar over the desegregation. So that was a really complicated situation where local law enforcement may not have been able, even if they were trying to, did not have the manpower to handle these massive riots and fighting between the various groups. And so in order to assist, martial law was declared. So for another example was 9/11. So I'm going to give you, this is from the same paper. I'm going to let you see this. This is Articles of War Response to the Attacks of September 11, 2001. And I'm going to read you a little piece of this. In response to the September 11, 2001 terror attacks on New York City, the Pentagon, Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, which provided that the president may use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided in terror attacks or harbored such aggression, such organizations or persons. During a military action in Afghanistan pursuant to this authorization, a U.S. citizen, Yasser Hamdi, was taken prisoner. Now here's where it starts getting interesting, right? So in response specifically to 9/11, Congress passed this law saying the president can now act on any organization or country that may be hiding the Al-Qaedas, right? So they captured an American citizen who was in Afghanistan helping the Al-Qaeda group. Now this is where it gets interesting. The executive branch argued that it had plenary authority under this article to hold the enemy combatant for the rest of the hostilities, which, as you know, was a 20-year war in Afghanistan, and to deny him meaningful recourse to federal courts. In Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, that was Donald Rumsfeld was the SecDef, the court agreed that the president was authorized to detain a U.S. citizen seized in Afghanistan, although the majority of the court appeared to reject the notion that such power was inherent in the presidency, relying on a statutory ground. However, the court did find that the government may not detain the petitioner indefinitely for purposes of interrogation and must afford him the opportunity to offer evidence that he is not an enemy combatant. So the court said you can hold him as an enemy combatant, but you cannot deny him the right to speak for himself in a court or a tribunal and be recorded on the record. Same thing would apply here. The court rejected an executive branch argument that foreign prisoners being held at Guantanamo Bay, this is Rasul versus Bush, were outside of federal court jurisdiction. The court distinguished earlier case law arising during World War II that denied habeas corpus petitions from German citizens who were captured and tried overseas by military tribunals. The court noted that the Guantanamo prisoners or petitioners were not citizens of a country at war with the United States and had not been afforded any form of tribunal and were being held in a territory over which the U.S. exercised exclusive jurisdiction and control. They found that statutory grounds existed for the extension of habeas corpus to these prisoners. In other words, they did have a right to petition, have a representative, and try to make their case, even if they ultimately wound up in prison anyway. So you see, this is not, a lot of folks look at the concept of martial law and they'll say, oh my God, they're gonna take your guns and kick in your doors. But different things have happened in different situations. Now, so hold on just a second while I figure out what the hell I was doing here. Oh, wrong one. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, this is not a simple button that you push and magic occurs for the government. They can't just do that because the Supreme Court said, yes, you could put that person in custody or you can take them into questioning, but you cannot do it forever because that's not what we do. So after the fact or when challenged, very often certain things done under martial law is wrong. Now, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II, martial law was declared in Hawaii, which was attacked, so that was fair. There's a large Japanese ethnic group or ethnic community in Hawaii because they're in the Pacific, right? Duh. So a lot of them were segregated into camps or they were denied certain rights. Toward the end of the war, that got challenged in the Supreme Court, saying, hey, wait a minute, there's still citizens, they were denied due process, especially after the initial couple of months where it was clear that Hawaii was not under imminent threat of invasion, and certainly after the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet was basically obliterated, but you kept these people in camps. That is illegal, and they won. The Supreme Court ruled that the declaration of martial law exceeded, partly because there were still civilian authority available. See, so this, a lot of folks are like, no, they declare martial law, we're all fucked. Well, not really. Not really. And I think it's important when we talk about a topic like this, which is very frightening and also very controversial, that we have to have an even balance. We try to look a little deeper than the face value. So state governments. Now this is NOLO, N-O-L-O, which is a legal website, and they put out some really neat papers. I'm probably not doing you any justice there. But it says the U.S. Supreme Court has explicitly held that individual states have the power to declare martial law within their borders. Typically, a governor's power to declare martial law originates with the state constitution. But even under martial law, state officials must comply with the U.S. Constitution and federal laws. You guys tracking me here? Federal courts generally won't second guess whether states' governors' declaration of martial law is necessary, but they will review whether actions taken under martial law are constitutional. And this again goes back to if there is still civil authority, right? So even if Washington, D.C. disappears, right, something terrible happens, the federal government is not functional. There's still state governments, and by the U.S. Constitution and probably the Constitution of most states, even if, say, for instance, Texas, right, something happens in D.C., the leadership is discombobulated, Governor Abbott down here declares a state of emergency. We still have guarantees under the Constitution. He can declare curfews. He can put the guard on the street. He can put volunteers on the street. As a matter of fact, in the state of Texas, the county sheriff can call former guardsmen or licensed carrying civilians or veterans who have honorably or who have been discharged, as long as it's not a dishonorable discharge. if it was a medical general or honorable, they can be requested to come back, do a quick background check, and they can actually create posses or quote unquote county militia, basically a county posse to protect the county. And then if you get 5 or 6 counties working together, you make a pretty big safe zone very quickly. So again, a lot of moving parts. It's not just a button bloop and everybody no longer has rights. But it gets tricky because in the heat of an emergency, people could wind up getting put in confinement and nobody may know they're even there. So how do you appeal what the martial law guys have done if you don't even know your friend's in jail? So again, very complicated, but rather than resort to martial law, and this is where I was talking about earlier about emergency powers, most states rely on emergency or police powers to protect public safety and quell civil unrest. So what is the difference? So martial law basically says the governor or the president, let's just go with the state, the governor says, something has happened here, martial law is being declared. The military are making the rules answerable to the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general, right? And basically the chain of command, civilian side. An emergency power is actually flipped around. What it is the state is now, at the request of the local jurisdiction, providing state assistance in keeping law and order. So now the sheriff of the county now has the asset of the National Guard, and the sheriff and the commander will work together to ensure the general safety of people. Now, a good example of this was during Hurricane Harvey. After the storm beat up the coast, all the water that had been dropped to the north came down the Trinity River Basin, which is west of the Mississippi, east of Houston. I don't know if you guys have to look for that, but anyway, it's basically where Texas and Louisiana meet. And Beaumont and a few towns there got absolutely flooded because right after the storm. So the storm was gone, but then the floodwaters were coming back to flow out into the ocean, into the Gulf of Mexico, and flooded the area again. At least 2 guard convoys that I know of showed up in some of these small cities and towns, tried to set up a distribution, had people actually jump on the vehicles, trying to pull the drivers out or get them to stop on the side of the road, not at the designated place, so they could get stuff out. The convoys were then turned around. Thanks to a group of morons, the National Guard commander or the NCOIC of that convoy said, "This is unsafe. I can't deploy my guardsmen here. We're not armed. We're a supply unit, and they're trying to get into our trucks while we're still on the freaking road." And they packed up and left. So now all the civilians were screwed because basically the National Guard and the Red Cross went, "Y'all aren't behaving." So they had to bring MPs from Fort Hood, or what was Fort Hood. They had to bring state troopers. They brought some state police down from Oklahoma and Arkansas and Border Patrol to run security on the distribution site to keep it under control. Local police could not keep control of it. There were actually gunfights in the street over groceries because local authority was overwhelmed. The National Guard basically said, "We can't do this without armed security," and we're leaving, and they basically bailed. But other than those situations, a emergency or police order, emergency power, simply says the governor is authorizing the use of state assets. The governor will oversee, but it will remain in the integrated command system. And typically, by the time it gets to that point, you probably have a state-level emergency response or TOC, Tactical Operations Center, somewhere in the state, kind of coordinating all the people on the ground. But then you're going to have a local operations center for the same purpose, to coordinate people locally. So these are important distinctions to understand, because without these kind of distinctions, it's very easy to panic when you hear the words emergency power, martial law, but people don't dig into this. So I wanted to throw that out there. Role of the National Guard, I'm just going to add this. Government officials sometimes Call in the National Guard during civil arrests and national disasters. In 2020, state governors deployed the National Guard to gatherings that protested police and to assist with the Rona. That's not what they say, the Rona. I'm just using the Rona. So, Jackson, you're going to be around. You want to go to jail? Go to bed. Go somewhere else. I'm going to call the National Guard on Jackson, which is essentially Bentley and Peppermint. I just tell them to go chase Jackson, and they chase him around the house. So, see, I have my own martial law right here. Anyway, back to the subject. Each state and the District of Columbia has its own National Guard staffed by civilians who serve part-time bases. Most of the time, the National Guard is under state control. State governors can activate the National Guard during local or statewide emergencies, hurricanes, protests, riots, etc. Right? Under the Insurrection Act, the president can call upon or federalize the National Guard to suppress a domestic rebellion or enforce federal laws, and hence why the National Guard was called up by the feds for the Civil Rights Act, because it had become federal law, but it was not being enforced or was being resisted to such an extent that local authorities could no longer enforce it. The president can also deploy National Guard troops overseas, which we all know they did rotations. Mobilizing the National Guard is not a declaration of martial law, which we all should know already. The National Guard serve as a backup, not a replacement for civilian government. Again, as long as there is still a civilian government of a functioning type, even if the governor passes away, the governor is incapacitated or gets sick, the lieutenant governor, the county judge, the county sheriff, these are still the civilian authorities. They have the ultimate ownership of their areas. So, and Bentley has found the coronavirus toy. For those of you who did not see the COVID toy, look at my other video. National Guard members are required to attend one drill each week and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that wasn't really what I wanted to talk about. But you notice how complicated this is. This is not a, oh my God, button press. Now, what happens if they legit declare martial law? So let's just say the governor's right. Wow, this situation has gotten out of hand, martial law. They can impose curfews, media blackouts. They can suspend habeas corpus. They can commandeer businesses, which is what we saw during the Rona, which was the Wartime Production Act, but that was actually a passed law. Prohibit certain sales like alcohol. Well, it makes sense, you don't want a bunch of drunk idiots. Control hospitals and emergency facilities. Regulate wages and working conditions. That one I didn't know before, so that's interesting. And require mandatory fingerprinting. So back to the subjects. Impose curfews and media blackouts, suspend the writ of habeas corpus, commandeer businesses, prohibit sales of alcohol, control hospital and emergency facility priorities, regulate wages and working conditions, and require mandatory fingerprinting. Now, a lot of these martial law and your rights, government officials can invoke martial law under certain limited circumstances, but checks and balances remain. You still should have a right to an attorney and to a hearing in a timely manner. And so long as there is a civilian government functioning at some level, you still have those rights as well. Now, so for example, so then it brings the question now, all right, now that we've gone into the legalities, brings the question, so what could happen? Well, a lot of it depends on the state. So for instance, the state of Texas and actually 26 other states now have what are called a state guard or a state defense force. This is a group of volunteers that are taught specific jobs or specific MOSs for the military, and they backfill the National Guard when the National Guard is deployed or otherwise tangled up. A good example is during Hurricane Harvey. I was actually a member of a state guard unit that did communications, and I wound up in a trailer with Air Force and National Guard. There were three of us, one from each group. I was assigned to that National Guard unit. We were running the comms trailer during Hurricane Harvey out of Johnson Space Center. Yes, the Houston, we have a problem area, we were in the middle of it. Actually, we were on Ellington Joint Reserve Base doing that duty, right? 27 states have these or have reactivated them since 9/11. Those groups will defend the Constitution and of the state and the federal Constitution, but they report to the governor only. The president cannot call state defense forces or state guards up. They can call the National Guard up. So also the National Guard typically reports to the governor. So some uncharted territory is if a president says, I declare martial law, and the Washington D.C. says, oh, well, we don't like the fact that you're all protesting X, so we're going to declare martial law across the U.S. And Texas goes, yeah, that's what I think of you and your martial law. I'm pulling my guardsmen, which they did during the D.C. situation. The guardsmen being made to sleep inside a damn parking garage, and multiple states pull their guardsmen. They're like, no, we're taking them home, or we're not sending them. That's uncharted territory. Now what? The National Guard troops are normally the people living in that state. So if, Chicago has a complete fiasco and Illinois can't manage it, and the president says, well, Texas, send your National Guard up there, and Governor Abbott says, no, screw that, I'm going to keep them here because you lost control of this shit, there's no precedent. And then there's always a question, for instance, okay, so you have National Guard in the state. Say the National Guard say, peace out, we're not obeying. People are like, well, it'll be the feds versus the National Guard, but not necessarily, because if something like that happened, you may have military commanders who say, you know what, the president's request is unlawful. And that's a whole nother thing that I'm not even qualified to talk about, but it's a possibility that a commander will say, this is not a lawful order. I will not comply with this request. I will not arrest the civilians. I will not fire at civilians. You have other commanders who will fire on civilians. Okay, it happened during the Civil Rights Movement. Actually, it happened in New York during the Civil War, not because there was a riot. The riot broke out not because they favored the Confederacy or anything like that. It was a riot of working class people in New York City who found out that richer families could pay a $200 fee and get their sons exempted from the draft, whereas all the working class folks had to go to the draft or they got thrown in jail. Now, for comparison, in the 1800s, the 1 ounce of gold was $20 US, actually $20.67. So think about that for a second. $200 was roughly 10 ounces of gold then. 10 ounces of gold now at $2,000. Think about that. 20 grand, if I did my math right. So, yeah. Who the hell has 20 grand in their pocket? So think about if they had a draft today of the young men and women to go to war, and they said, oh, but your kids can be exempted, but it's 20 grand a kid. Who the hell can afford that? I mean, some people can, but many won't. And that's what caused a riot. And Lincoln, because the National Guard was already, really they didn't have a National Guard the way we know it today. It was more state militias at the time. Sent federal troops into New York City and shot up the rioters and bayoneted them. Same thing happened during the Civil Rights Movement. So there are commanders who will fire on civilians. There are others who may say no. And again, it depends on the situations. And this is where you get into this gray area. This is where you get into the what ifs and what could be's. And it's anybody's guess how this could play out. But I wanted to point out, and this was a much longer video than a lot of my other ones, but I wanted to point out that this stuff is not set in stone, and it's not simple, nor is it straightforward. It can and does have nuances, it has checks and balances, and there are scenarios that have just not happened, but could, in light of what has happened recently, could have happened. And if they did, what the hell would we do? So how do we act? What do we do as preparedness-minded folks? Well, there are a lot of things. First of all, be in the know. Pay attention without panicking. Understand what's going on. 2, have food, water, medical, the basics in your home. If something happens in the street, you don't want to have to go out there to get Pampers or rice or milk or whatever. You want to be as ready as you can in your own home for as long as possible to stay off the streets. Now, If you can get a carry license, it's better, because once you have a true license, you've got a background check going. That makes you a valuable thing to the state. As a matter of fact, in Texas, there's a caveat that in an invasion or a great emergency, the governor can ask concealed carry holders to step forward as volunteers for various tasks, because we already have a background check done, right? This is opposed to constitutional carry, where they haven't background checked you. We're already vetted, right? And in Texas alone, there are 3 million out of the 27 million people, 3 million, so over 10% of the populace has done their background check to carry concealed. Plus I can cross state lines like that. So again, there's so many little possibilities, but we need to be aware of what's going on, stay up on the news, pay attention to incidents that could escalate, and you can be valuable to your community. If you're a volunteer firefighter, I mean, aside if you're a cop, firefighter, etc. already, you can volunteer to work on your county or state emergency response committees. My county has one that I have yet to reach out to because I've just been too busy. Also, I'm an essential worker because in the energy sector. So is my wife, Sassy. So the two of us have that valuable asset where we would probably get a letter exempting us, like we did during Rona, saying, hey, these people need to be able to travel. And they need, if necessary, the governor can say, no, they need to carry because they're involved with fuel, or they're involved with energy, or they're involved with infrastructure. 3, get to know your responders, right? A lot of people are like, the police, the firefighter. No, get to know them, talk to them, volunteer with them, find out what's going on. The more you know, because typically the responders are going to know before the general public, and very often before we all do. Like we're watching as preppers, but they're going to know the official word, like, hey, this is going down. It helps to know. So, and that's part of that networking mag thing. Even if it's not a mutual assistance group, it's a mutual knowledge group that all of you can share information with one another so that you can prepare. And again, creating a mag, having a family mag, teaching your friends, relatives, and neighbors how to do their own preps so they can be safe. Now, you got to be careful who you reveal yourself to. Again, much more complicated, but understanding how this works, understanding what rights you may or may not have, and understanding that it's not a one button solves all solution is important, because it'll dictate the way we react. And again, it purely depends on the type of situation you have going on. So ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this otherwise very lengthy video. I hope you guys got some value out of it. Again, it's a lot more technical than I intended to, but I hope you all can now see why it's important when you hear these, channels will talk about, martial law, they'll talk about civil defense, they talk about troops in the street. It's not always cut and dry how that's going to play out. And it can vary drastically between New York, Houston, West Texas, Arkansas, and LA. I mean, you could have 5, 6 completely different situations. We saw it during the Rona. People were out having drinks in bars and playing football in Texas, and they couldn't even step foot out of their apartments in Los Angeles. So again, you get what you vote for. So if you didn't like whatever happened during 2020, understand that'll probably happen 5 times worse if they declare martial law in your county. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of this video. Thank you so much for joining me on yet another one of the Domino Effect videos. I hope you all have a great week, great weekend. And you guys, Godspeed, be safe, and I will see you on the next video. You guys take care.